Hebrew guy, so Hebrew, I struggle with Hebrew. So I had to kind of go talk to some Hebrew guys to figure this out because I really didn't, I got to admit, I just don't know. And so I go try to find somebody that does. So I talked to some Hebrew guys. We started talking about this word create. We talk about that word. God created. And it's Elohim bara, right? So it's in this word create. What does it mean? What does it mean to create? And that's kind of an interesting thought, isn't it? This word in the Greek, this word bara in the Greek, or in the Hebrew, I'm sorry, bara. And it's the same way you get in Psalm 51:10. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. It's exactly the same word. And the psalmist here isn't saying, rip my heart out of me and make a brand new heart and put a brand new heart in me. I think we understand that, right? He's saying to fix my heart, to create, to do something to my heart. So I really started studying this word bar, and it occurs about 50 times in the Old Testament. And to know what a verb kind of means, we have to know the subject of the verb. And every time in the Hebrew, the subject of the word bar is God. So it's a divine creation. But it's used for a lot of different things. It's used for, in Isaiah 65:15, it says, you will leave your name for a curse to my chosen ones. The Lord God will slay you, but my servants will be called by another name. This idea of a name or creating a name. And you can't see the bottom of that slide, but he used it to create groups, phenomena like wind or storms, to create people like the Israelites, to create abstracts like purity and praise. God creates purity. God creates praise. So what does it mean to create, right? Well, now you can look at it two ways. One thing you can say is, well, it means to make something from nothing, but we can't do that. I can't do that. I don't know about you, but I don't have that ability. But I'm a mechanic, right? And so when I'm building an engine, I have, well, let's see, where'd I go? So let's go. I got one more. Okay. So anyway, let's go. So let's talk about Genesis 1 second before I get there. So in the beginning, if you really read Genesis 1, if you really read that text, it says in the beginning, right? It says the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God moved across the surface of the deep. Genesis 2. The earth was formless and void, and the darkness was over the surface of the deep. So what existed? Is it a starting point that doesn't lack matter, but it lacks order? In other words, we don't really have to take Genesis 1 to say, okay, God made everything right then. I'm not saying God didn't make it. I'm saying God didn't create it. I'm just saying I don't think you have to look at Genesis 1 and say, in the first day, God made everything. Because the word create in the Hebrew really doesn't mean to make something from nothing. It means to make order. The darkness and the sea and the ancient world are elements of chaos. The Hebrew word is tohu. It means lacking worth or purpose. So when it says the earth was formless and void and the Spirit of God moved across the surface of the deep, it's chaos, it's disorder, it's worthless, it has no point, it has no purpose, it has no functionality, right? So think with me for a minute. So you can take all the parts of something in like an engine, and I can have all those parts laying on the table, and it's an engine, technically, right? Technically, but it has no function. It doesn't work, right? And in order for that engine to work, I have to order it. I have to create it. I have to put it into a functionality, don't I? I have to make it do something. And so I take all those parts and I make an engine. I put them all together, and now I've created the engine. You see? Now, it probably didn't take me as long to create the engine as it did to create all those pieces that I used to make the engine. Does that make any sense? And I'm going to try to get through this because it's really I've really kind of got to this thing, and to me it's really fascinating. You might not like it. I hope I get to the end. So, why did God call the light day? It's interesting. It says, if you really read the text, it says in this text, it said, God saw the light that it was good. God says, let there be light. Now, light is not a physical thing. I mean, it is, but it's not. You never walk outside and go, oh, I hit the light, right? Light. And so when it says God created the light, what does that mean? Did God create the sun to make the light? Because we're not two like the heavens yet. And why did he call it day? Because God wasn't really worried about light. He made it a day because he's worried about what? A day is what? Time. You see? In other words, God wasn't really worried about how I made the light, how I put the sun up there and how I made that light. I don't care. What God wanted just to see is that I made time. Because I made light, and I made dark, and I made day, and I made night, and I made time. And that's a big thing for a God who is eternal. To say, I created time. I ordered it. You see? I'm putting things in order. And so if we read through the text, God made time. God made weather. God made food. If you really read through the text here, it says, God saw the light was good. God separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day. The darkness he called night. There was evening, and there was morning, and there was time. Our whole world's about time. Do you agree with me? Everything we do is about time. Everything. How many times a day do we say, what time is it? Right? And then God made weather. Right? God made weather. Didn't he? You don't make weather. But God ordered the universe so that weather would happen. We understand that. We understand science, right? God didn't make weather. He made all of this. He made it work. He made airflow, and he made highs, and he made lows, and he made ocean currents, and he made all this stuff. He didn't make it. He made it work. I read a thing the other day that said, I think the North Atlantic Ocean current will eventually stop, and then weather will all change. God made it work, you see. And then he made food. And it doesn't say God made food. It said God put seed in the ground and it grew. Well, you and I read into that, well, God made seed. I'm sure he did. But God doesn't want us to know how he made seed. God doesn't care. What God wants us to know is that I made you something to eat. I take care of you. I've given you the things you need to live. Time, weather, food. Isn't that what you need to live? Time, weather, food. I don't need to explain the science to you. Science doesn't matter. Does it? Does science really matter? When you sit down and eat a piece of bread, do you need to know the science of how wheat happens and how germination occurs and how all these things happen? Or do you just need to know that I have a piece of bread? Right? Science doesn't matter. Doesn't matter to them. Really doesn't matter to us. In the end, we like it. But at the end of the day, I don't have to know how things work. I build engines. I understand everything there is to know about an engine. But when you get in your car, you don't need to know. Do you need to know everything inside that engine and how all that stuff works? It's a good thing we don't all need to know everything that we do to do everything things, because we would never get anything done. Am I right? You just need to know when you hit that key, it starts. That's all you need to know. The science is irrelevant. God knows we don't need to know these things. The science is irrelevant. They're not interested in the manufacture of material, but in the function of it. You see, on our science, we're worried about the manufacture. How did God do it? How long did it take God to do it? How did he do that? Does it matter? It works. Does it work? It works. We're all here. Right? Are you more worried about how? Or are you more worried about the fact that it functions? Right? They're worried about functionality. In Genesis 8:22, after the flood, what happened? God says, while the earth remains, seed time, harvest, food, cold, heat, weather, summer, winter, day and night, time shall not cease. When Noah came off of the ark, you know what God told Noah? He said, you're going to have time, you're going to have food, and you're going to have weather. What else do you need? He reordered the universe, didn't he? He reordered it. Just like he did in Genesis. He created. He reordered it. These things are going to occur from now on. I've fixed it. I'm moving fast. Functional ontology. Ontology is the study of how things work as a group. Functional ontology. In the ancient functional ontology, existence is defined by function, not origin. They didn't care where we came from. They didn't care how we came. They didn't care how we were made. They had no use for any of that. If you're going to read Genesis through ancient eyes, then you got to read it through ancient eyes. They could care less. You know what they cared about? They cared about the same thing you care about when you sit in your car and turn your key, that it starts. That's what they cared about. Weather's going to happen. Food's going to happen. Time's going to happen. Those things are going to happen. That's what they were worried about, and that's what God was reassuring them of. Genesis 1 is an account of functional origins, not material origins. He never meant to explain to us how he did it. What he explained to us is how he made it all work. We don't need to know the rest of that. It's fruitless to ask what specific thing God's created on any given day. It's fruitless to ask that question. Since the text is not concerned about the existence of matter or formational history. It just isn't. It's irrelevant. How long did that stuff exist? How long was it formless and void before God said, well, I think I'm going to get around to make all this stuff come together? How long did those parts on the bench before one day I said, I think I might build that engine? You know what I'm saying? Who cares? Who cares? God laid it on there for 1 billion years. I don't care. Makes no difference to me. What matters to me is that when God said, let's make this work, he made it work. I'm going to move because I want to get to this point. I'm trying to get to this. So if we get to this point, and maybe, are you thinking, you may either think I'm crazy maybe, but are you beginning to think about Genesis 1 a little bit differently than maybe how you thought about it before? When you read it, about the idea of what God was doing and what God wanted us to know. You know, what do we want from God? We want assurance. Isn't that what we want, really? I mean, if I said, what do you really want from God? You'd say, I want assurance. I want assurance that heaven's real. I want assurance that when I die, I'm going to have eternity, right? I want assurance that you hear my prayer. I want assurance that you love me. Isn't that what it's all about with God? I want assurance, don't I? Well, you know, if you lived in that world and you had to go out and hoe that ground every day to make your food and you had to do all those things that they did, you know what you want? You want a God who says, I made this, I control this, and I'm going to give you what you need. Isn't that the message of Genesis 1? I made it, I control it, and I will give you what you need. And if we really look at it that way, it changes our view, or it should change my view. I mean, I'm going to tell you, this was a real journey. This has been a real journey for me. But it really changed my view of how I looked at what was going on. But there's a part missing here. There's something missing. Because in 6 days, God does all of it. And then on the 7th day, God rests. And I'm thinking, why did he rest? Don't understand. God get tired? Did God say, whew, making all this stuff work with a lot of work, I'm going to take a break. Right? I don't think God gets tired. So I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, why? And I'm thinking, well, there's a Sabbath rest. Made the Jews rest on the Sabbath, but I'm thinking, there's no Jews. There's no Jews here. Right? There's no Sabbath rest here. There's none of that here. So why did God rest? Makes no sense to me. So I thought, oh boy, 6, that's the climax of creation. He makes man, makes woman, and it's very good. You know, we've all heard that. And man, that's the climax of it all. That's the pinnacle of creation. But then when I really start talking to Hebrew people, and I really start looking at Old Testament, I really start looking at the time of these people, and I really start looking about temples, and I'm in Italy, and I'm like, what are temples for? And then I come to realize that guess what? The climax of creation is not day 6. The climax of creation is the 7th day. God rests. And you say, that seems anticlimactic, right? I mean, doesn't seem like it's a big thing to rest, does it? Doesn't seem like that's a real big thing. kind of anticlimactic. And so I'm saying, well, what are temples for? Not just temple in Jerusalem, but all these temples. Delos, there's 40-something temples. We went to the Apocrypha, temples up there, the temples on the side of the mount. Every place we drove, the tour guide would say, well, there's the temple to Zeus. There's the temple that went to the temple up aside, and there's a temple here, there's a temple there. And I'm thinking, what are temples for? Right? So in my mind, I'm thinking, well, sacrifice, right? Go, God, go. So I start studying these ancient cultures, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, all these cultures. And you're like, well, what happens in temples? God rests. That's where God's rest. And to them, that made perfect sense. God rests in a temple. That's what temples are for. God comes there, God's rest. You come and make sacrifice to Him, you come and give Him your offering, you come and give Him whatever because they're resting. They don't live there. That's not where they live. But they rest in the temple. What to you and me, that doesn't mean anything because we're not Old Testament people and we're not temple people. So rest, for God to rest doesn't mean anything. But to these people, once again, high context, low context, right? We're low context. To these people, when you say God rested, that meant something. Because God's rest in temple. God didn't rest because He was tired. Tired had nothing to do with it. God doesn't get tired. God wasn't wore out after 6 days and said, man, that's all I can do. I'm done. Right? When Solomon built the temple, if you read that account, if you've ever studied that in the Old Testament, that temple really started with David. Right? David's the one in 2 Samuel 7. David said, I want to build a temple to the Lord. Nathan said, you do whatever your heart wants to do. And then God turned Nathan around, right, and said, you can't do it. Your son's got to build the temple. So David, what did David do? David started getting cedar from Lebanon. He started getting gold, and he started getting silver, and he started getting all these materials, and he started piling all these materials up. And when Solomon finally took over, he told Solomon, he says, listen, I've got all this timber. I've got all this gold. I've got all this silver. Right? You need to build this house to God. You need to build a temple. Well, first thing Solomon does, build a house for Solomon. Right? But then when Solomon finally gets around to it, and Solomon takes all these years, and he builds this temple. But it's not a temple. It's a building. Right? It's there. But it's not a temple because it can't be a temple unless God rests in it. So Solomon spends all this time, starts with David, all this time, all this energy, everything, building this huge temple. And then guess what? The building's done. And then Solomon says, we need to inaugurate the temple. So Solomon takes 8 days, inaugurates the temple. God comes in, rests, now it's a temple. Then let's think about creation for a minute. It says, talking about matter, talking about function, not matter, right? We don't know how long that matter was there. We don't know how long that existed. We don't have a clue. I don't have any idea. I just know it says, in the beginning it was formless and void, and the Spirit of God moved across the surface of the deep, and there was matter there. Right? God functionized it. He ordered it in 7 days. And at the end of 7 days, He rested in His creation and He sanctified it. He rested in the temple. You see? And so for you and me, when we get to that 7th day, we get to that rest, we think, oh, well, that's anticlimactic. God rested. What He told the Jews to do on the 7th day. It's all tied together. That's how I think about it. So I thought about it for my whole life, right? I didn't think anything about it. God rested. But then the more I thought of it, why would He do that? What difference does it make? Right? Because I'm low context. But then when I get to looking at this, and it's like, God rested because God came into His temple. God sanctified. God ordered it in 7 days, and then God dwelled in it. He rested. God's rest in the temple. And so this very idea started to work on me, and I started thinking, how does this work, right? And so I started looking, okay? And I started looking at the Psalms. You know, God is setting up a sacred space. Man is the climax of the 6 days. Rest is the climax of creation. God is setting up a sacred space, isn't he? Read Genesis. Read Genesis. God comes to walk with man in the cool of the day, right? God's setting up a sacred space, a space he can be with his creation, right? Now let's look. So I thought, okay, so let's think about this for a minute. I'm still formulating my idea, thinking, how does this work? Does this really work or not? So I begin to look, and I go to Psalms 137. It says, let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, to your resting place, you and the ark of your strength. Arise, O Lord, to your resting place. God's rest in temples. You see? Arise to your resting place. Where's God at? Where God's with Moses. God's in the temple. God's in the tabernacle. God's in there because that's where God. We understand that God can't exist in temples made with hands. But in that world, in the ancient world, in that society, you made temples for God to rest in them, and that's where you met your God. God said, I'm going to make this sacred space. I'm going to rest in my space. In Psalms in 132, 13, and 14, it says, for the Lord has chosen Zion. And anytime you see Zion in the Bible, it's the city of God. It says God has chosen Zion, because that's how come we sing, oh, Zion, Zion, a long thy place to dwell. Zion to them was probably Jerusalem. But Zion in literature and theology, Zion always represents where God dwells, city of God. That's how come we sing that song. Oh, Zion, Zion, along thy gates to see. Oh, Zion, Zion, when shall I dwell in thee? We're not saying I want to dwell in Jerusalem, right? We're saying I want to dwell where God is, city of God. And so it says, for the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his habitation. And what does he say? He says, this is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. Here is my resting place forever. Where did God's rest? In temples. Where's God resting? In Zion. Where do we want to go? Zion. Why? Because that's where God's resting, because that's where God dwells. But when God created this earth, when God created and made this creation and put all this functionality in it and made everything work, God dwelt here. God made it a sacred space because God rested in it. And it's just a fascinating idea to me. And it's something that, and you might think I'm an idiot. I don't know. But I just love this whole thought process. And it really inspired me to think more. And so I go to Hebrews 4, 3 through 11. And if you look at Hebrews, it says, for we who have believed enter that rest. Just as he said, I swore in my wrath, they will not enter my rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world, for he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day. And God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage, they shall not enter my rest. That passage never really made sense to me until this made sense to me. And then all of a sudden that passage made all kinds of sense to me. God's resting. And I'm going to enter his rest. Not my rest. Not where I'm going to rest. I'm going to where God's resting. I'm going to Zion. You see? I'm going to the temple of the living God. And it really started to work on my thought process. He says, therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly had the good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience, he again fixed a certain day, today, saying through David, after so long a time, just as has been said before, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, for if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. So there remains a Sabbath rest. When did God rest? The seventh day. Right? We don't keep the Sabbath. there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest. See? So when I'm thinking about heaven, because I really like to work, I like to do things. I'm always doing something, right? And heaven always seemed kind of boring to me. I shouldn't say that, should I? Heaven always seemed a little boring to me. We're all going to go to heaven. We're all going to rest all the time. We're all going to sing all day. And I'm thinking, that's going to get old, right? Just being honest here. You mean eternity's a long time, right? I mean, it might be good for 1,000 years, 10, I don't know, 15,000 years. But eventually I'm thinking, I'm going to get tired of resting, right? And so heaven always seemed a little bit dull to me. Like I'm just going to go there, I'm just going to rest. I don't really like to rest. But then I didn't understand that's not at all what it's talking about. It's saying I'm going to go enter that rest. I'm going to go be with Christ. I'm going to go be with God. It's not about not doing anything. It's about being in the temple. When God rests on the seventh day, he sanctified this earth. He made it. He sanctified it. He made it his temple. He made it where he dwelled. And so that's what we see. That's what we see in Hebrews. Okay? Is that very idea. So you might think it's crazy. I don't know. I know this is something maybe you've never heard before in your life, because to be honest with you, I'd never heard this before in my life either. But I get to talk to some guys who headed me this direction, and got to listen to some lectureships that headed me this direction. And the more I got into it, the more fascinated I became with the whole concept of what it really means to enter that rest. God's rest. So let's think. We have no problem with the day being a 24-hour period. Scripture backs that up. I have no issue with that. A day is a 24-hour period. Isn't that what God said? He said, I separated the night, I separated the dark. You and I know what that means. 24 hours. I mean, I don't have a problem with that. That's exactly what God did. God ordered it. God made time, which to me is astounding. Because I don't know how an eternal being thinks about time. Do you? But he did. He made it function. So what's happening during these days? God is ordering things. He's making it work. He's putting the engine together that was laying on the table. He's assembling all the parts. He's making it all work. He's making it all function. He's making it where me and you can live and survive and thrive on this earth. Most of the discussion is about the age of the earth. If 7 days are like the temple inauguration, things are not necessarily being made in the 7 days. They're being ordered. David started the temple. Solomon finished the temple. Years went through in there before it was ever built. But it still wasn't a temple until God rested in it. Right? So if we're thinking of it this way, if in fact the days are concerned with bringing order instead of making things, then it might have nothing to do with the age of the earth. Y'all want to throw things at me yet? We get so worried about science, people. We get so worried about defending our faith. We think when somebody says the earth's 1 million years old or 1 billion years old, that we have to find some way to make that work. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Irrelevant. Makes no difference. I believe God did it. I believe God ordered it. I believe God made it. Nothing else really matters to me. I can't go back all those years. I was a guy who went through all these things. Day age, young earth, heard all those arguments about moon dust and gravitational pull and alignment of the planets, and heard all those arguments about the earth's only 10,000 years old, heard all the arguments about dinosaurs, all that stuff in Job about dinosaurs in Job, all that stuff about dinosaurs being destroyed on the ark. I've heard the mature earth theory. You ever heard that? Mature earth theory, where basically God created the earth mature, so we would think it was really old, even though it really wasn't, because God wanted to trick us. And 5,000 years later, he wanted us to argue how old the earth was. That's a good one, right? God just wanted to trick us a little, so he just made it look old. Not old, but kind of like that old car. You patina finish it, make it look real old. That's what God wanted to do, you know. Million theories. At the end of the day, matter. Doesn't matter. This earth is too perfect. Things are too wonderful. Things are too marvelous for it to be made any other way. There's no other way. Nobody can ever convince me. This world is too magnificent. Things are too awe-inspiring. We forgot to look. Because we're old. Or I am. We took our little Marley out, little girl that comes with us sometimes, comes and stays with us sometimes, and we took her to the restaurant the other night. We got out kind of early, and she's waiting on her dad, and the moon was like it was the other night. It was about 3/4 full, and I said, boy, Marley, I said, look at that moon. And she ran up the end of the sidewalk. She goes, amazing. I said, you know, it's funny. I see the same moon, but to me, it's just a planet spinning in the air, isn't it? I forgot how miraculous it is, haven't I? Haven't we? You know what science has done? It's taken away our wonder. But it shouldn't. Because it's magnificent. Isn't it? For the wind to blow, for the rain to fall. Isn't it magnificent that stuff grows out of a seed in the ground, that babies are born? Isn't it magnificent? I think it is. And God made all that happen. And you know, to me, it's important that God made it from nothing, like the Hebrew writer says. I mean, that's important. But you know, I've made a whole lot of things in my life that were worthless, that didn't work, that were bad. I've cooked a lot of dishes in my life that you couldn't eat. I mean, all the ingredients were there, but you couldn't eat them because it was awful. I've built a few engines in my life that blew up before they ever got out of the shop. Right? And I'm just being honest. And God made all this work. Anyway, I'm quitting. But I hope that you, if nothing else, I hope I made you think a little bit about, maybe a little different about Genesis than how maybe you thought before. Hope Curtis doesn't get mad at me, because I know that's probably not what the apologetics press would really want me to say. But it's been a fascinating journey for me, and I'm glad I got the chance to share it with you. Thank you for your time.